Component lifecycle in Apache NiFi. Here you can see a component lifecycle. The NiFi API provides lifecycle support through the use of Java annotations. The org.apache.nifi.annotation.lifecycle package contains several annotations for lifecycle management. The following annotations for lifecycle annotation may be applied to Java methods in an NiFi components to indicate to the framework when the methods should be called. For the discussion of component lifecycle, we will define NiFi components as a processor, controller services, parameter providers, or reporting task. At onAdded, the at onAdded annotation causes a method to be invoked as soon as a component is created. The component's initialized method or init method of if subclass abstract processor will be invoked after the component is constructed, followed by the method that annotated with onAdded. If any method annotated with onAdded throws an exception, an error will be returned to the user, and that component will not be added to the flow. Furthermore, other methods with this annotation will not be invoked. This method will be called only once for lifetime of a component. Method with this annotation must take 0 arguments. At enabled, the at onenabled annotation can be used to indicate a method should be called whenever the control is enabled. Any method that has this annotation will be called every time the user enables the service. Additionally, each time that NiFi is restarted, if NiFi is configured to auto resume state, the service is enabled, the method will be invoked. If a method with this annotation throws a throwable or log message, and bulletin will be issued for the component, in this event, the service will remain in an enabling state and will not be usable. All methods with this annotation will then be called again after a delay. A service will not be made available for use until all methods with this annotation have returned without throwing anything. The method using this annotation must take either 0 arguments or a single argument of the type org.apache.nifi.controller.configuration context. Note that annotation will be ignored if applied to a reporting task, parameter provider, or processor. For a controller service, enabling and disabling are considered lifecycle events as the action make them usable or unusable by other components. However, a processor and a reporting task, these are not lifecycle events but rather a mechanism to allow a component to be excluded when starting or stopping a group of components. At onRemoved, the at onRemoved annotation causes a method to be invoked before a component is removed from the flow. This allows resources to be cleaned up before removing a component. Method with this annotation must take 0 argument. If a method with this annotation throws an exception, the component will still be removed. At onScheduled, this annotation indicates that the method should be called every time the component is scheduled to run. Because controller services are not scheduled, using this annotation on a controller service does not make sense and will not be honored. It should be used only for processors and reporting tasks. If any method with this annotation throws an exception, other methods with this annotation will not be invoked, and a notification will be presented to the user. In this case, methods annotated with at onScheduled are then triggered, followed by method with the at onStop annotation during this state. If any of these methods throws an exception, those exceptions are ignored. The component will then yield this execution for some period of time, referred to as the administrative yield duration, which is a value that is configured in the NiFi.properties file. Finally, the process will start again until all the methods annotated with @onSchedule have returned without throwing any exception. Method with this annotation may take 0 arguments or take a single argument. If a single argument variation is used, the argument must be a type of process context. If the component is a processor, or configuration context if the component is a reporting task. @onUnscheduled method with this annotation will be called whenever a processor or reporting task is no longer scheduled to run. At that time, many threads may still be activate in the processor's onTrigger method. If such a method throws an exception, the log message will be generated, and then exception will be otherwise ignored, and other method will with this annotation will still be invoked. Method with this annotation and maybe may take 0 arguments or may take a single argument. If the single argument variation is used, the argument must be of type process context if the component is a processor, or configuration context if the component is a reporting task. @onStopped method with this annotation will be called when a processor or reporting task is no longer scheduled to run, and all threads have returned from the onTrigger method. If such a method throws an exception, a log message will be generated, and the exception will otherwise be ignored. Other methods with this annotation will still be invoked. Methods with this annotation are permitted to take either 0 or 1 argument. If an argument is used, it must be of type configuration context if the component is a reporting task, or of type process context if the component is a processor. @onShutdown, any method with this annotated with the @onShutdown annotation will be called when NiFi is successfully shut down. If such a method throws an exception, a log message will be generated, and the exception will be otherwise ignored, and other method with this annotation will still be invoked. Method with this annotation must take 0 arguments. Note: while Wi-Fi will attempt to invoke methods with this annotation on components that use it, this is not always possible. For example, the process may be killed unexpectedly, in which case does not have a chance to invoke these methods. Therefore, while methods using this annotation can be used to clean up resources, for instance, they should not be relied upon critical business logic. With the API, the annotation type on added, the mark annotation of a processor, control a service, or reporting task implementation can use to indicate a method should be called whenever the component is added to the flow. This method will be called once for entire life of a component instant. The annotation type on configuration restored, mark annotation that the processor, reporting task, or a controller service can use to indicate that the method with this annotation should be invoked whether component's configuration is restored after a restart of NiFi. Annotation type on disabled, mark annotation of a control service can use to indicate a method should be called whenever the service is disabled. Annotation type on enabled, mark annotation of a control service that can use to indicate method should be called whenever the service is enabled. Any method that has the annotation will be called every time a user enabled the service. Additionally, each time the NiFi is restarted, if NiFi is configured to auto resume state and the service is enabled, the method will be invoked. Annotation type on removed, mark annotation of a processor, control service, or reporting task implementation can use to indicate a method should be called whenever the component is removed from the flow. This method will be called once for entire life of a component instance. If the method throw any throwable, that throwable will be caught and logged but will not prevent subsequent methods with this annotation or removal of the component flow from the flow. Annotation type on scheduled. Mark annotation of a processor or reporting task implementation can use to indicate a method should be called whenever the component is scheduled to run. This will be called before any call to on trigger and will be called once each time a processor or reporting task is scheduled to run. This occurs in one of two ways. Either a user click on a scheduled user click to the scheduled the component to run, or NiFi is restarted with auto resume state configuration set to true, the default value, and the component is already running. Annotation type on shutdown. Mark annotation of a processor, controller, or reporting task implementation can use to indicate a method should be called whenever the flow is being shut down. This will be called at most once for each component in a JVM lifecycle. It is not, however, guaranteed that this method will be called on shutdown, as the service may be killed suddenly. Annotation type on stopped. The mark annotation of a processor or reporting task implementation can use to indicate that the method should be called wherever the component is no longer on the schedule to run. Methods marked with this annotation will be invoked each time the component is stopped, and will be invoked only after the last thread has returned from the onTrigger method. Annotation type on unscheduled. Mark annotation of a processor or reporting task should be called whenever a component is no longer scheduled to run. Methods marked with this annotation will be invoked each time the framework is notified to stop scheduling component. This method is invoked as other threads are potentially running. To invoke a method after all threads have finished processing. See the unstopped annotation. See the on stopped annotation. Here you can see at on added is connected to at on enabled, and at on enable is connected to at on removed, and at on removed is connected to at on scheduled, and it is connected to at on unscheduled, and it's connected to at on stopped, and it is connected to at on shutdown. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.